If you don't have a Bible with you, a leader will hopefully either give you a Bible or put a Bible in somebody's hands around you. If you're on the Bible app, I'm just going to trust that you are actually on the Bible app and that you're not like on TikTok or Instagram or texting or something like that. I'm also... Omega, stay with me, okay? Hey, we have an awesome after party tonight. Hey, we're going to be cooking some burgers, hanging out for the next 20 minutes. For the next 20 minutes, stay with me, okay? So turn to Exodus chapter 16 in your Bible, and we're going to talk about the next segment of this story of Exodus. If you've been with us for the last couple of weeks, we've been unpacking this book, the second book of the Bible, where God, he really goes from this being that's outside of really what's happening in the day-to-day of his people's lives. We see in the book of Genesis, the very beginnings of God stepping into the story. But for the most part, Exodus is where we see God go from this powerful being into a God that rescues and restores. And he shows up in the lives of the Israelites. And God is going to rescue his people from Pharaoh, out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Okay? I just actually got back this last week from Hume. I was up there teaching at the junior high camp. And I was there all week long. That's actually where I met some of you last summer for the very first time. I was actually teaching at Hume when Three Crosses was in camp last year, and I didn't work for Three Crosses yet, which was kind of this weird, serendipitous, probably a God moment where I got to teach campers that weren't my students yet, and here we are, 6, 8 months into being, to me and my family moving from San Diego to the Bay, and some of you that I met for the very first time, or didn't meet, but maybe saw from afar last summer, I now get to be your pastor, which is kind of a crazy God thing. So I'm stoked to be here, stoked to be in the Bay. I just moved to Hayward. Anybody live in Hayward? Hey-o, okay. Brand new, literally for the last week have lived there. But when I was at Hume, Piper, my 3.5-year-old, how many of you have met Piper? My little girl hanging around, okay? My 3.5-year-old now, she's old enough that when I go on these speaking engagements, I get to teach at various camps, and when I go and teach at a camp, Piper always asks me, she goes Dada, can I go up on stage with you? And I'm at first, when she first started asking me, I was heck yeah. And then this last time, not Hume, but the camp I spoke at before that, I brought her up on stage with me, and there was a couple hundred high school students there, and they all started chanting Piper. And they were Piper, Piper. And my little 3.5-year-old, she got this look in her eyes, and she got on stage and she did this. I kid you not. She looked at this look and she goes, she became a communist leader, right? Like a dictator in front of her people. And I was as a father, there was some slight concern where I was am I raising a narcissist? Is this little girl gonna think the whole world revolves around her as these hundreds? Imagine, have you ever been in front of hundreds of people that are all chanting your name over and over again, and you're and you're standing in front of those people and you're just taking in that moment? That's kind of insane, right? And so every time we go to Hume or any of these other camps, when Piper's hey Dad, can I go on stage with you? I'm yeah, our new rule is this. I'm you can come on stage with me once. And what I'm concerned about is my, at a 3.5-year-old, it's kind of whatever, it's kind of cute. But if this was to continue for years to come, my main concern is pride, right? I don't want my daughter to walk around thinking the world revolves around her. That's the last thing I want. I want her to be confident, absolutely. I want her to experience this freedom, but I don't, those are the worst, the worst people in your life are the people that walk around just thinking that they're the cat's pajamas, right? They just walk through life, they just kind of stroll, chest out, and they're life is about me, and you're right? Nobody likes being around that kind of person. But here's the crazy thing about pride, right? Pride doesn't just manifest itself as like arrogance or bravado. That pride, more often than not, it shows up in your life as insecurity. Pride shows up in your life as self-consciousness. You ever heard the word self-conscious? Like, I'm just feeling a little bit self-conscious. I'm feeling a little bit insecure. Hey, we all struggle with that in some way, shape, or form, for sure, right? Whether you're willing to admit it or not. Like, every single one of us wrestles in some way, shape, or form with this, like, insecurity, self-consciousness. Like, maybe you showed up at Omega tonight and you wrestle with these ideas of, like, who am I going to know? Like, do I fit in? Am I cool enough? Am I pretty enough? Am I funny enough? Like, maybe we have to put on that mask a little bit. And sometimes pride shows up as arrogance. More often than not, pride shows up as insecurity, as self-consciousness. Right? And you go, whoa, 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 how is that pride? Pride just makes me the center of the story. And so if I'm arrogant and bravado, right, like that's pride. But if I'm self-conscious and insecure, that's also pride. It's making me the most important thing in the story, or the most important person in the story. And so what I want to talk about tonight through the lens of the Exodus is, what is the antidote to pride? You know what I mean by antidote? Right? You ever seen like a zombie movie before? Right? And they're like, we need the antidote. Like the virus is spreading and they get the antidote and they start like, injecting it in the arm and it like heals the virus that is killing. Okay? So if the virus is pride and every single one of us has it in some way, shape, or form, right? To live in such a way where you are free from pride, the way that we live that, in that freedom, right, is this. C.S. Lewis defines it like this. He says, this is humility. Humility is not when we think less of ourselves. It's just when we think about ourselves less. Does that make sense? Right? Sometimes we think humility is thinking less of ourselves. Right? You ever seen somebody who's like has like a false humility? You're like, oh my gosh, you're so pretty. And they're like, no, I'm not. And you're like, okay. This is weird, right? Like, you're like, I don't want to argue with you. Or how about this one, right? Right, the one where it's like, somebody's like, hey, you had a great game. Like athletes out there, it's like, hey, that was a great game. And you go like, oh, it's all for God. It's all God. And it's like, okay, I thought I saw you playing the sport, not God, but that's weird, right? Or it's like, how about this one, right? Where you're like, you compliment somebody on like their outfit, and you're like, oh my gosh, like I really like that shirt. And they're like, oh, thanks, I got it for $1.50. And you're like, I didn't really ask how much it was. Like, that's weird. Like a lot of the times we try to like reflect, we're not very good at receiving a compliment or an encouragement. And a lot of the time that's because we think to be humble is to think less of ourselves. And really that's not humility. Humility is thinking of yourself less. And high school student, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior in the room, let me tell you this. If you could start practicing thinking of yourself less now, let me tell you, the freedom that you would experience in life if you could walk through life not as the main character in the story is incredible. Right? Like the freedom that humility brings of being able to enter into spaces not crippled by like, what do these people think of me? And do I fit in? Do I not fit in? Do I belong? Do I not belong? Right? Like the amount of times we'll throw an event at Omega or something like that, and we're like, we're doing this thing. And then somebody will show up and there'll be like 30, 40, 50 people there, and they'll be like, no one's here. It's like, what do you mean no one's here? Well, the 3 people I know aren't here. And it's like, sometimes we're crippled by like, we can't show up to a space free because we have to have like our 1-2 people that we feel safe in because we don't know how to enter into other spaces. And the way that you free yourself from all of that and just be able to like live your life and show up and serve and walk into a space, not asking the question like, do I belong here? But like, where can I show up for other people here? The only way that's possible is if your life isn't about you. If your life becomes about something so much bigger than you. If you've ever read the Exodus story before, it's really easy to start thinking that the Israelites, like the main people group of the story, are like absolute idiots. It's really easy to think that. And if you don't believe me, just read the story. The amount of times that you read about the Israelites and you're like, these people are actual idiots. Like the amount of things that they forget, the amount of things that they do, like what they do or what they don't do, like what God asks them to do, and then they're whining and complaining, and you're like, oh my gosh, Israelites, like what are you doing? Until you start realizing that the entire nation of Israel is like an archetype for us. Like the way the nation of Israel responds to God is absolutely the way that you and I respond to God thousands of years later. For example, okay, read with me in Exodus 16. Exodus chapter 16, second book of the Bible, big number 16, verse 1. If you're there, say preach. It says this: the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin. Not like Sin, it's just what it was called, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat, and we ate all the food we wanted. But you, Moses, you've brought us out into this desert to starve, and this entire assembly to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough food for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on all the other days. Hey, pause real quick and look up at me. So the nation of Israel, they come out into the desert in the middle of nowhere. And this isn't like Coachella desert. It's like middle of nowhere desert. Like Egypt is really, honestly, at this point in time, the only civilized place in that entire region. So when they go out into the desert, there's really nothing there. And all of a sudden they get hungry and they get whining and complaining, and they're like, Moses, you just brought us out here to die. They're like, back in Egypt, we had all the food we could possibly want. Okay? If you know the story, or if you've been paying attention over the last couple of weeks, maybe help us out by filling in the context. Back in Egypt, they had all the food they could possibly want, but they were also what? They were slaves. And not like slaves like, oh, this is like kind of slavery, like gnarly slave, like 400 years. That's a long time. Like generations upon generations upon generations of their family were complete slaves. Like slaves to the point where Pharaoh, he was perceived as God. Like if Pharaoh said, you know what, there's too many Israelites, which he did in Exodus chapter 1. He went, there's too many of them. Let's just kill all the firstborn babies. Just kill them all. Like any baby that's born, if it's a boy, kill him. And the whole nation of Egypt goes like, aye, aye, Captain. Right? And like that's the power he has. That's the evil that they lived under. And then all of a sudden they get a little bit hungry and they look into the rearview mirror and they completely forget the context that they were in. Hey, turn to Numbers chapter 11. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. Okay, start in verse 4. Hey, read this with me. Numbers chapter 11, verse 4. The rabble with them began to crave other word, which, real quick, you should start calling people rabble, okay? Because that's just funny. I mean, you probably shouldn't, but that's Moses' way of insulting certain people in the nation of Israel. He calls them rabble. He's like, the rabble among them. What a word. The rabble among them began to crave other food. So when they were hungry and they're complaining, what does God provide for them? It's called manna. It's like this bread from heaven, and God's like, you know what? I'll provide for you. I'll bring down this bread literally from heaven. God is a God that provides, that he sees them, he enters in. He's not a distant God. Right? And he provides this manna, and then all of a sudden, right, they get tired of the manna, and they're like, oh, we're sick and tired of eating this manna, God. And again, this is another moment where you're like, Israel, seriously, like God provides for you, and still that's not enough. Sound familiar? Okay. It says, the rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We have never seen anything but this manna. Okay? Pause real quick. Look up at me. If only we had meat to eat. We remember what we ate in Egypt at no cost. LOL. Right? Like, again, sorry, remind me what they were in Egypt? Slaves. Okay? I remember I went to Biola University. Biola costs like $60,000 a year. Okay? Your boy's 32 years old, and I'm still paying for Biola University, right? Like, it's absolutely crazy how expensive that school is. But when I got to Biola as a freshman, they handed me like a little red Bible, and they were like, hey, we got you this little red Bible. It's a free gift from us. And I was like, that's cute, right? Like, it's not a free gift, right? Or either, like, that is the most expensive Bible in the world. It's a $60,000 Bible, and then my education's free, right? Like, that would be the same joke. It's like, that's not a free Bible. Like, I paid for that time after time after time again. The Israelites go, we remember the food that we had at no cost. They're completely forgetting this life that they had lived. They turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You know the ride Soaring Over California? You ever been to Disneyland and gone and soaring over California, and there's like the orange spray and all this stuff, and you're like soaring over? We are currently soaring over the Pentateuch, okay? The 5 books written by Moses. If you're like, that's cheesy, I'm a dad. I'm allowed to say whatever I want, okay? Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 says this. This is called the Shema. Right? In Israel, if you are a religious Jew, right, you would go to temple every day and you would say the Shema. Every morning when you wake up with your kids, you would say the Shema. This was something on a daily basis they would remind themselves of. And it says this. It says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road. When you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. When the Lord your God brings you into the land, out of Egypt into the promised land, he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give to you, a land with large flourishing cities that you did not build. Houses filled with all kinds of good things that you did not provide. Wells that you did not dig, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Hey, this is Moses writing to the nation of Israel, going, hey, go back to verse 6. He says, I'm going to give you some commandments. And then in verse 7, he says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on your door frames. Right? How many reminders is he asking them to write down, to put on their door frames, to tie in their hands, to put it on your forehead? If something is tied around your wrists and dangling from your forehead and written on your doorposts, and your parents are talking to you about it, and you talk about it when you lie down, and you talk about it when you get up, right? What do you think you're trying to do? Remember. Right? You're trying desperately to remember. Hey, girls, can you put your phones away for me, please? Gals, thank you. You're desperately trying to remember. You're going, I have to remember. Why are they trying so hard to remember? Because of the human propensity to forget. 282 times in the Old Testament, I butchered that number. 352 times in the Old Testament, God tells his people to remember. He calls himself the God that brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, over and over and over and over and over again. Why? The antidote to pride, the antidote to self-centeredness, the antidote to making life about you is remembering. It's living in light of who God is and what God has accomplished. How do I know that? Right? Deuteronomy 6, verse 10. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give to you, a land with large and flourishing cities that you did not build, houses filled with all kind of good things that you did not provide, wells you did not dig, vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. When you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord. Hey, if God rescues you out of slavery, sustains you through the desert, and brings you into this new land, how could you possibly forget it? Well, a generation goes by. And then another generation goes by. Pretty soon, you have Israelites that have grown up where? In the promised land. They were never in Egypt. They were never in the desert. So they just live in the promised land, in these cities and in these vineyards, and it's like, it seems pretty simple. Right? You go like, life is good. Look what we built. Look what we did. And all of a sudden, life becomes about me, and I'm forgetting God. Hey, turn back. We're going to finish right here in Exodus 13. Are any of you like your parents are first generation in America? Okay, a couple of you. Hey, for those of you, right, real quick. For those of you whose parents are first generation in America, do your parents talk to you about how they got to America? Right? Yeah? Do your parents tell you about why they came to America? For sure, right? So my grandpa immigrated from Argentina to the U.S. on a ship when he was 17 years old. He was one of 9 siblings, and their dad died. And so they were like, their mom, Catherine, this incredible woman with 9 kids, right, immigrated to the U.S. on this ship. They were on a ship for 4 months. From Argentina, they went all the way around Brazil, up to New York, came through Ellis Island, and they came to America for opportunity. Right? And those of you who are in here who are like second generation, like your parents were first generation from wherever they came from, my guess is they came to America out of extraneous circumstances, right? Or they won a visa lottery, or there was an opportunity in the U.S., or they moved away from something or towards something because they wanted to set up the next generation. Hey, but the reality is like sociological studies will show over and over and over and over again, first generation will come to America and work their tails off. Second generation will go like, wow, thanks, mom and dad. Third generation goes, this is America, right? Like, I've always been here. I've always lived this way. And you completely take for granted what your grandparents went through because you didn't experience it. You didn't live it. So when it comes to God and the nation of Israel, he's going, hey, trust me. I'm the author, designer, creator of life. I know that 3 generations from now, you'll completely forget Israel. Or you'll completely forget Egypt. You'll completely forget who I am, what I've done, what I've accomplished. And if we forget God, friends, then we start so easily making life about what? Me. Right? Me. And Martin Luther, incredible church father, in the Latin, he would define sin as incurvatus en se. It means when you are curved in on oneself. It's when life, like you just kind of become this black hole that like life is just about me. I walk into every circumstance asking, hey, is this something that makes me happy? and life becomes about like, what do I want, when I want it, how I want it. And maybe we don't walk around like that explicitly selfish, but it's kind of the state of our heart. And the antidote to that kind of selfishness, that kind of pride, that kind of self-centeredness is absolutely thinking less of yourself. And the only way to think of less of yourself, to think of yourself less, is to elevate God and put him in this position that only he deserves to be in. Hey, Exodus 13, let me read this for us. And I hope that as I read this for us, that you start hearing some of the language of Deuteronomy 6, and we start picking up on some of the themes that we're seeing in the book of Exodus, in the book of Deuteronomy. It says this, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites that belongs to me, whether human or animal.'" Hey, pause real quick. Look up at me. Weird verse to start out with in Exodus 13, but here's the context. Hey, Pharaoh and Moses have been having this face-off. The 10 plagues happen where Moses walks into Pharaoh's palace and he goes like, "Hey, let my people go." And Pharaoh says no, and then 10 times we'll see God's power demonstrated to Pharaoh, to the nation of Egypt through these plagues. And so he'll turn water into blood. There'll be frogs that cover the entire nation of Egypt. All the livestock of the Egyptians will die, but the Israelites' livestock doesn't. Right? The Egyptians break out in boils, the Israelites don't. God is demonstrating, these are my people, this is who I am, and this is the power that I have. The last thing that Moses, or that God does through Moses, is the firstborn male of Pharaoh's house, and then the firstborn male of the Egyptians that serve Pharaoh. The firstborns die, right? God enters in, and there's this moment of justice, and it might be really hard for us to wrap our heads around, right? Sometimes when you read the Old Testament, it kind of seems like the Old Testament God is super gnarly, and like the New Testament Jesus is this like gentle, like sash-wearing Jesus, and you're like, I kind of like that guy better. Right? But what we need to see and understand is like the depth of evil that was happening in a nation that was lording over a nation of Israel for 400 years in slavery, murdering their children. Right? The cry out for justice from the nation of Israel, the whole nation of Egypt deserved to be wiped off the face of the earth. So God stepping in this moment of justice was a moment that his people were craving. They were calling out for it. And so in the beginning of chapter 13, what God is telling them to do is he's going to give them these moments of ceremony that are going to help the nation of Israel for generations to come to remember who God is and what he has accomplished. Verse 3, it says, "Then Moses said to the people, 'Commemorate this day that you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today is the month of Aviv that you are leaving, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites.' That's the promised land. The land that he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey. You are to observe this ceremony in the month. For 7 days, eat bread without yeast, and on the 7th day, hold a festival to the Lord. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast in it is to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen anywhere within your borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead, that is the law of the Lord is to your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance at the appointed time, year after year." You hear Deuteronomy 6 in there? The tie it on your foreheads, bind it on your hands, do this year after year, ceremony, remember. And so here's my challenge for you. And in just a minute, I'm going to bring the worship team back up here, but my challenge for you is, as we close in worship, maybe you take a moment just between you and God, and you maybe you're bold enough to have a moment of prayer, a moment of clarity, a moment of honesty between you and God about the state of your own pride and the state of your own selfishness. How much of your life, if you're being honest, is about you? And then my challenge for you is this. Over the next week, right, we're going to meet again next Tuesday night. Over the next week, maybe you check in with your small group leader. Maybe as a small group, you come up with a plan. My suggestion is not that you eat bread without yeast or that you have unleavened bread. You're like, I don't know what any of that is. And it's like, yeah, that's not really a thing in our day and age. But maybe there's something that you screenshot and you make like the home screen on your phone. Maybe there's like a 3x5 card or a sticky note that you write something down and you put it on your mirror that you look into every morning as you're brushing your teeth. Like maybe, what is it in your life that you need to remember? Something that you're thankful for? Something that God has accomplished in your rearview mirror? Maybe it was Hume last summer. Maybe it's something that God has done in your life in this last year. Like, what is it that you and I need to remember to be aware of? And as we remember that, maybe ourselves, our own pride, our own selfishness starts fading as we elevate and remember who God is. Does that make sense? The nation of Israel was physically rescued out of slavery and easily forgot God. Right? You and I, we have the opportunity. The New Testament calls our bondage to sin, it calls us literally slaves to sin. That you and I, without Jesus, without the cross, without his resurrection, are literally in bondage to the sin and brokenness that is in our lives. Some of us are more aware of that than others. You ever genuinely tried to escape some sort of brokenness in your life and felt like you can't get away from it? That's what the Bible calls bondage, slavery. It's not slavery to a nation of Egypt, but is absolutely slavery to sin. And for those of us in this room that have surrendered our life to Jesus, that have given that over to him, the freedom that you can experience in Christ is like nothing else. It's this newness of life. But it's also really easy to forget. Ask any leader in this room. Right? We can experience the joy of following Jesus and the joy and the peace of the gospel, and then the next day, very easily forget. What is that physical reminder that maybe you'd be bold enough this week to go like, I need this actual physical thing in my life to remember who God is, what he has accomplished, and allow me to become less as he becomes greater. So in this next worship song, as the team comes up here, y'all can cruise up. Maybe this is just a moment just between you and God. Again, don't distract the person to your left or right. Like, love the person next to you enough to let them have a moment with God. Enter into this moment of worship. Do business with God. Maybe be bold enough to put your hands out in front of you in just a posture of receiving. Maybe it's hands up in a posture of surrender, but just do business with God in this last worship set to remember who God is, and in light of who God is, and how much he loves you, how much he's inviting you into relationship, how much he wants you to remember, because the more that we remember, the freer that we get to live our lives. Let's worship.